Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we have another great one for you this evening. Let's see. Well, I consider this a place to go if you want to escape reality. Not really reality, but I guess we'll say escape the news, at least for a little while here. Well, tonight, first of all, we have a guest his name is Jacques from Canada. And he posted his childhood UFO story on my website. And I should mention that I have an anonymous form there on podcastufo.com that anyone can fill out. And if they want to remain anonymous, actually, he reached out to me, so he didn't remain anonymous in particular. But after I read his story, I said, this is really a good enough story. I actually want to hear him talk about it. So I'm bringing him on for the first few minutes. He's going to talk about his sighting. Then after that, we have after Jacques, we have our main guest, David Halperin, and he was on this show a while ago, quite a few years ago, I think. And he was back in 1960s a teenage UFO investigator. He later became a professor of religious studies. His specialty, religious traditions of heavenly ascent. And he was at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And when he retired, he started writing. And back in 2011, he wrote Journal of a UFO Investigator. And now he's back to talk about his latest book, Intimate Alien, The Hidden Story of the UFO. Well, I am grateful for all of you who support the show. And I couldn't do this without you, actually. And we're over at Patreon. And that link is on our website, podcastufo.com. And our blog this week by Charles Lear is called When UFOs Were Soucoupe Volontaire. And that was my poor attempt at French. This has to do with early UFO reports in America and France. And without further ado, I'm bringing on Jacques. Welcome to the show, Jacques.
Hi, how you doing, Martin?
I'm doing well, thank you. And thanks so much for posting. Now you're in Canada, and can you just go ahead and I want to hear your story, the one you wrote,
Sure.
Just from your own words.
Sure.
And how old were you and all that, and where was it where were you located?
Well, I was about between 75 and 78, 79. So I was probably about 6, 7. It's a long time ago, but it's something that I've never forgotten. Somewhat northern Ontario here in Canada, just in the area of North Bay. And I grew up in a kind of rural property. We had a great spot. You would see moose, deer, bear. It was all over us. And the incident took place, it was probably late August. And I remember because it was really, really warm, and we didn't have air conditioning. All our windows were open. It was around 6:30 in the evening, and we had somewhat of a little tradition. After supper, we'd sit in the living room and watch a show. It might have been MASH or something. But so we were all sitting in the living room, and my father was an avid hunter. And he was one of these people that really couldn't sit still too much. He'd always he'd be looking outside, he'd be looking in the windows outside and looking for wildlife, because there was always wildlife. And often when we were sitting around watching a show, my dad would pipe up and say, "Hey guys, look." And we'd all get up and take a peek. And sometimes there was a bear, sometimes deer, and once in a while some moose. So it was common for him to pipe up, and he'd watch the show, but he wasn't, he wasn't super concentrated on it. He'd, be looking outside. And this one time he says, "Oh my God, what is that?" Something to that effect. And the way he said it, it was different than, when it was a moose or a deer. And I remember jumping up and running to the picture window. And it was a small house. So we were in the living room, and right next, my dad was sitting in his chair in the corner, and the picture window was to his right, and we were in front of him. So we ran up, and there was my mother and my brother and I. And I ran to the window, scanning the grounds for a deer or a bear or whatever. And I didn't see anything, and I'm looking around, and then I just noticed that everybody was looking up in the sky. And I looked up, and I couldn't believe it. So just to kind of give you perspective of what I saw, about 100 feet in front of our house, there was this great eastern white pine, a beautiful tree, probably about 70 feet tall. And over top of it was a triangle. It was massive. It was black. I still get goosebumps when I think about it, but it was so big. I remember afterwards talking to my dad, and he mentioned that the size was probably about 3/4 to a kilometer long, which not quite sure what that is. Half a mile, I think.
About half a mile, yeah.
Half a mile. And I mean, this thing was massive. When you looked up at the sky, that's all you saw. It wasn't directly over the house, but it was directly over the pine tree, and it just went.
What time of night was there daylight?
No, it was about 6:30 in the evening. And you know how in August, late August, you got that nice golden sun, warm. There wasn't a breeze. It was a perfect night. The sky was blue, no clouds whatsoever. And this thing is hanging there. And actually, when we spoke, Martin, about having me on the podcast, I grabbed some markers, my daughter's markers, and I drew something just to kind of give you an impression of what it looked like. And this is what I got.
Wow.
Yeah,
that does look pretty big. Hey, that's not a bad rendering.
Oh, it was.
Yeah. Here, let me do this so people can see a little better. There you go. Yeah.
There you go. And there's the great eastern white pine in front. Now, this doesn't do justice. It was bigger than that. I just couldn't get it on this standard size piece of paper.
Sure.
And so there it is. There it is. It's up in the sky, and immediately my father walks over to. We have a front door, and it was kind of strange because the front door didn't lead to anywhere. It kind of dropped off. We were in a raised bungalow, and it dropped off to the ground, which was about 6 feet below. My father hadn't built the deck at the time. And as he was walking over to the door, he mentioned to one of the kids, my brother and I, turn the TV off, and we did, and it was silent. He opened the door, and he kind of stood in the doorway, kind of in the frame, looking up, and my mom kind of tucked in right next to him. Instantly, my brother and I, we went into these little windows. So below picture windows, I don't know if you remember this, Martin, but they might still exist, but there was these little windows below that you could slide open, and there was a screen, and my brother and I knew exactly how easy it was to pop the screens out, and we each grabbed an opening and popped the screens out and stuck our heads out. I was basically up to my waist out of the window and looking up. What I found absolutely strange was that there was virtually no sound. There was maybe a bit of a hissing sound, but there was nothing. There wasn't even birds chirping. Everything was quiet. There wasn't traffic. Nothing was moving. And we're staring up at this thing, and my brother and I were looking at each other thinking, what is this? This is ridiculous. And we're watching for 30, 40 seconds, and the telephone rings. And my mother, she went over and picked up the phone, and my dad's like just staring, and I heard my mom say, yeah, just a second, I'll get him. And then she calls over to my dad, can you take the phone? And my dad was annoyed. Oh my goodness, he wanted to stare at this. at this thing. And he walked over, he grabbed the phone, and he said, yeah. And the person on the other end, which I found out afterwards was a neighbor, said, she told him, there's this huge thing over top of our house. But what I could hear wasn't that. I couldn't hear that. We found that afterwards. But my dad was like, yeah, I see it as well. I have no idea what it is. I got to go buy it. He hangs up the phone, and he walks over back to the door. And I'll tell you what she said to him a little later. But so now he's back at the doorway, and then he realizes, wow, somebody get me my binoculars. And so he calls out to one of us, and I forget if it was my brother or I, but somebody grabbed the binoculars, brought it. Actually, I think it was me, because I gave him the binoculars, and I remember standing there thinking, am I going to get a turn? And he's just looking up at it, and he's taking his time. So I just went back to my little window, stuck my head out, and kept watching. And then he's watching it for a bit, and I remember him saying to my mom, you got to watch it. You got to look at this. Take the binoculars, take a look. Now, this triangle, kind of in the center of it, there was, it looked like these little lights in a circular, but you could tell that there was like a protrusion coming down. I don't know how big, but the reason I say that is because it was like the lights went into a semicircle, so I couldn't see the other side. So I estimated, I figured that it was a protrusion. My dad says, take a look at the lights. And my mom grabs the binoculars, and she's like, oh my goodness, is that? And then she says, is that? And she's about to finish her sentence. And my dad stops her and says, yes. And I by that time I had come out of the window, and I was looking at them, and I was looking at their eyes and thinking I was going to get a turn next. And my dad's eyes were this big, and he said, yes. And the way he stopped her was kind of like, that's enough. We don't need to say anything. And I was like, can I have my turn? And my mom looked again, and then he said, he asked her, can I have the binoculars back? And he grabbed the binoculars, and he kept looking. And at that point, we noticed that just up the road, not up the road, but just next to us, kind of at a 45-degree angle from the front of our house, was my grandparents used to live there, and my aunt was standing on the front porch, and she was waving at us, and we noticed her, and she's looking at us, and she's doing this sign like, what is it? Do you see this? And we're like, yeah, we see it. We have no idea what it is. And we just kept watching it, and all of a sudden it started moving, and everybody immediately said, wow, it's moving. And it moved for a bit, and about the length of the craft, it moved. And by the time it got to, let's say, 3/4 of a kilometer that it had pushed, we could just see the back end of it. It just disappeared. It moved so quickly, it was gone in the blink of an eye.
Do you think it moved, or do you think it just flashed?
We stood there.
Yeah.
You know what? I thought about this a lot, and actually I spoke to my father when we were adults, when I was an adult, about it. But I remember seeing a slight acceleration in speed, and then it was gone. But it was so quick, and I had never seen anything move like that before. But it was gone, and it was north. It went north from there, and actually North Bay, which was north from where I lived, it had a place that was it's called the Sage. It's connected to NORAD. It's a command center that was interlinked somehow, but that's the direction it went.
Wow.
We were speechless. We all kind of just kept staring at the sky, wondering if there'd be anything else. We were looking to the opposite direction to see if there was maybe more coming, and there wasn't anything. We were looking at each other, wondering, what was that? And we ended up at that point going outside. And I think when I wrote on your site and I recounted the story, I didn't remember this part, but I've been really thinking about the details. And I remember we left the house and we went to go see my aunt just to talk to her. And I remember walking over to my aunt, and she looked at us, and she was wonderful with kids. She looked at us and her eyes were big. She had a big smile. She goes, "Did you see that? That was wonderful. It was so big." And we were asking her, "What do you think it was?" She says, "I don't know, maybe visitors from somewhere else." And we were so excited. And my dad started talking to his sister, and she said, he asked her, "Did you see the lights?" And she said, "Yeah, I saw it. It was in the center." He said to her, "We looked at it with the binoculars, and then they started, whispering. And I heard a couple of little things, but I couldn't quite make it out. But I heard it was like people. I heard like there were people." I asked, "What was it, Dad?" And he said, "Don't worry about it. We'll talk about it later." So we chatted a little bit with my aunt, and then we went back home. And we sat around the kitchen table. And I remember my dad getting himself a beer, lighting himself a cigarette, and thinking, "This is incredible." And my brother and I were just asking questions like, "What was it? What was it?" My dad's like, "I have no idea what it was. It's definitely not man-made. This thing was huge. It just hovered. It didn't move." So we asked my mom, "What did you see? What was it?" And finally she said, "You know what? I looked at I looked at the lights. It seemed it wasn't lights at all. It looked like windows." And we were like, "Windows? Oh my goodness." She said, "It looked like there were people looking at us. There was like movement or, something that made her think that it was something alive that was looking back at us." Well, I'm like, what, 6? I'm freaking out here. I'm thinking to myself, "Oh my goodness, what are you talking about? There's like aliens?" And my mom said, I don't know. It was, this is what I saw, and I could see movement. And that was it. And then, so my brother started talking and saying, "Oh, it's definitely aliens." And he takes off and he goes into his bedroom and he comes back, and he liked to read a lot. And he had these magazines, UFO magazines, and there were pictures of, drawings of witness accounts or abductees of aliens. And he shows me, he goes, "That's probably what you saw." And he shows it to my mom. "Is that what you saw?" And my mom said, I couldn't see that much detail. I could just see something moving." So I'm looking at it. Oh my goodness, is this what's going on? Is this what was in there? So we talked, and it went on. The evening kind of dragged on a little bit, and the night kind of came to. The sun set, and things got dark. And my dad was across from me, and right behind him was a window facing south. And you know how you get that reflection because it was light inside the house. You could see your reflection. Well, I started seeing eyes staring back at me, and I was startled. And I remember jumping on my mom and going and kind of hiding my sight of line from the window behind my father, kind of. And my mom's like, "What's the matter?" "I'm seeing eyes. There's an alien out there." And of course, it was probably my imagination. And, my brother's, he's saying, "Don't worry about it. It's nothing, you didn't see anything." And so we talked a little bit about it some more. And finally, it was time for bed. And you think I was going to go to bed? There was no way I was going to go to bed. And my parents got, somewhat irritated, and they said, "You got to go to bed." So I remember walking over to my bedroom and peeking inside my bedroom, and my curtains were open. And of course, it's like a mirror again. I see my face, but then I see eyes again. Oh my goodness. I scream and I run back to my mom. I'm like, you have to go. I'm not going to bed unless you shut those curtains. My mom's like, "You're being ridiculous." And my brother starts laughing at me. So I begged her, and finally she went in and she shut the windows. And I got ready for bed and jumped into bed. And I remember laying in bed, and my parents had turned the light on outside, the porch light in the back. And just below the curtains, I could see light from the window. And for whatever reason, the window was open, so my curtains were moving a little bit. And of course, it made the light move a bit. I was losing it. I'd get underneath the covers. I was so terrified.
Yeah. Really traumatized you.
Oh my goodness, it was crazy. And for a couple of months, it was really strange, because when it got dark out, and now all the windows are now mirrors reflecting what was inside, I would run, and let's say I was going into the living room, I would run into the living room and kind of dive onto the couch and try to kind of hide myself from the window, but there was no place you could hide. There was always a window in sight. But I did this for months, and my parents thought I was crazy, and my brother, of course, laughed at me. And but you know what? To this day, I still get startled when I walk into a room and I get when it's night out and I get that reflection. I just get that little feeling inside me, like, oh my goodness, okay, wow. Nobody's out there, nobody's watching me. It's good.
Yeah. Well, we ran a bit long.
There was something I forgot to mention.
Yeah, but
sorry.
I'm going to have to wrap this up a little bit, but go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I was just going to say, when we were all sitting around and talking after the incident, I told my dad, wow, I can't wait to tell my friends at school. School was just around the corner. And I remember the first day of school, and my dad told me, he says, don't you dare. You're going to be laughed at. You're going to be called crazy. Well, what did I do? I told my friends. When it was story time in the library, and the librarian told me, she says, you saw a weather balloon. I looked at her like, are you kidding me? That was not a weather balloon. She says It was a weather balloon, and she dismissed it. That was it.
Yeah. So as far as from that point on, did you ever talk about it, or?
So yeah, we talked about it on and off for the next couple of months, and then we forgot about it. And my mom, when I was an adult, I never spoke about it to my mom. For some reason, I don't know why, but my dad, the year before he died, I remember we sat down and we had a couple of drinks, and I asked him, I said, Dad, I need to ask you a question. And he pretty much finished my sentence. He says, it's about that triangle we saw. And I said, yeah. And I mean, you could see the stress. There isn't a day that I've not thought about that thing. He says, I have no idea what it was, but I wish it would come back. And that's pretty much it. Since then, I've had little sightings, but nothing, kind of some things in the sky at night, but nothing like this. This was incredible.
Yeah. Did he ever say what he saw in the binoculars? Did he spell it out?
Yeah, he described it. He said that he couldn't quite see like the details of a face or anything like that, but he could see movement. So, whatever that means, he was trying to describe it. He could see it looked like, and it would stop, and then there'd be a little bit of movement, and they would stop again. And they assumed it was something looking back at us. But he was, I asked him, describe the event, because I didn't want to kind of contaminate his memory or mine, I guess. And I asked him to recount it, and it was pretty much exactly what I told you, except I think it was the time frame. I had originally thought it was mid-August, but he said no, it was closer to the end of August. He said, "Don't you remember you went to school like the following Monday or Tuesday or something like that?" So it was pretty much exact.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we actually made it right up to the break here. So,
okay.
All right. So thanks so much. That was really great.
Anytime.
I really appreciate it.
No problem.
And anyone can see that story right on the website, podcastufo.com, under UFO sightings.
Thanks
All
a lot,
right. You take care, Jacques. Thanks for agreeing to come on.
You too. Take care.
All right. All right, everyone. So we are going into the break right now. Actually, before I go into the break, I just wanted to say this is I guess you would call this a shameless plug for my artwork. So I live up in Maine, and I just started to do some local scenes. I live right on the coast here in Maine, so this is the latest of the paintings that I've done. I've also done a lot of different types of paintings over the years, and anyone can check out the paintings over at this is Aurora Borealis here. Actually, this painting was an accident, how that came out like that, and so I went with it. And also I do abstract work, and that's martinwillisart.com. So check that out. And if anyone sees anything over there that they sort of fancy, all you have to do is use the code UFO and you get 50% off. Now, I also want to say this too, because I like to get my artwork out there so I can keep painting. If anyone sees something that they really, really like and they're interested in it, contact me and we'll work something out. Again, I like to get the paintings out there. So I am going to, this is during the break, actually. I'm going to bring my guest on early. I'm going to have to introduce him twice. It's only because the way this the sighting kind of ran over the time that I thought it would. So I'm bringing him back in now. And David, welcome to the show.
Well, I am delighted to be here, Martin. Thank you.
I'm going to have to introduce you a second time because we're during the break right now.
Okay.
Yeah. And I also have to bring in KGRA radio so they can tell us when we go back. So anyway, thanks so much for agreeing to come back. So I guess what I'll do, David, since we have a couple minutes left, probably 2 minutes or so left to this break. Where are you located? You're in...
I am in Durham, North Carolina.
Durham, North Carolina. And have you been there a long time?
Oh, I've been in North Carolina now, I think, 44 years.
Yeah, that's pretty long.
Been a while, yes.
Yeah. Now, is the area known for any UFO sightings?
Not that I know of.
Ah.
I wish I could tell you that that's one of our claims to fame, but I don't think it is.
I see. We're getting a little bit of noise. It might be from the cable on your mic. If you want to pull that around front, a lot of times the cables will rub and make noises. So,
is this better now?
I'm still hearing a little bit of it. It's like when you move this kind of a little bit of a noise. Maybe it'll settle down. But you're also first in flight there.
That's true.
Yeah,
we were where the Wright brothers, for the first time, flew a heavier than aircraft that ended up higher than it started.
Yeah.
Only a few feet, but those few feet were epoch-making.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, you're going to have to work a little bit on that cable. Why don't you put the cable around the back of you? Maybe that will change things.
Maybe let me try unplugging it and plugging it again.
No, that's not it.
How's this?
Still hearing the noise. It's funny we didn't hear it during the sound test.
Should I try it without the
I think
earphones?
we may have to do that. Yeah. Is that unplugged now?
It's unplugged.
Okay.
All right, gentlemen, we are coming back in 5 seconds.
All right, sounds good.
Stand by. In 3, 2, 1, go.
All right, we are back, and my guest is David Halpern. This is the second time I'm welcoming you. Welcome to the show, David.
I'm delighted to be here, Martin. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and you have a book. This is your second book. But I'd like to talk to you about, you were actually a UFO researcher in your teens, and along with Jerome Clark, which is...
yes.
Yes. A funny story about Jerome. Back when I wasn't doing these shows live, I was pre-recording. Jerome was on my scheduled to come on my show. And so I got him on Skype and I started recording. And so I started in the conversation. He goes, "You haven't read any of my books?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He goes, "Well, this interview is over then." And that was as far as I got with him. And he
Oh,
said, if you
my.
want to, he goes, if you want to read one of my books, then schedule it and I'll be back. So
Oh,
anyway, it didn't go well.
good. He's an extraordinary man.
I know he is, and he's a musician, and he's there's a lot going on with Jerome, and he's one of the best researchers out there. Been at it so long.
Well, when I was 15 and he was 16, we used to exchange 10 and 20 page letters about
Oh, wow.
UFOs.
Really? Wow.
We go back so far.
Wow. And so I know that was a long time ago, but how did you get interested in the topic so young?
I was 12 going on 13. And a friend of mine and I decided to write an extra credit paper for science. And I think we were going to do it on life on other planets. And we decided we're going to have a chapter on flying saucers. Back then, flying saucers was the more common name for them. This was in the fall of 1960. And we bicycled to the public library of Levittown, Pennsylvania, and there were 3 books on flying saucers there. One was by Carl Jung, Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies. And a second was Gray Barker, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. So I borrowed the book, took it home, and began reading it. And pretty soon I was so scared, I wanted to hide under my bed.
Oh, like the last guest. Yeah.
It was an extraordinary story, by the way.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
That the if your viewers have not read They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, they have a rare treat in store for them. It's an extraordinary book, and that's the book that created what I will call the myth of the 3 men in black, or more generally, the men in black, that finally made it to Hollywood screens 40 years later. But that was the central theme of Barker's book, that there are men in black who visit you if you found out too much about flying saucers and terrorize you into silence. I read that book, and instantly I was persuaded by it. And I saw it as my mission at age almost 13 to follow in the footsteps of the men whom Barker described in the book and unravel what Barker called the secret of the elusive discs. That was the beginning.
Now, when was that book published?
1956.
Oh, wow. Okay, now I got to tell you, we're getting a little feedback from me. You're going to have to turn your volume down on your speakers just a little bit there.
Let's do that.
Okay, you want to still
Better
be able
now?
to hear me. It sounds like it's
Yeah.
okay. Yep, thank you.
I hear you fine.
So 1956. And wow. And is that book's long out of print, but you can probably find it.
No, it's been reissued in paperback.
I see. Oh.
So I think anybody who wants it can get hold of it.
Uh-huh. And so you dug right in at a very, very young age. And how long did that last?
My first answer is going to be until I went to college.
Mm-hmm.
But there are 2 more accurate answers. One answer is until my mother died, which was a year before I went to college.
Wow.
And that to me was the pivotal event in my early ufology. And we can talk more about that, why that should have been so. The other answer, which is an even truer answer, is that it's lasted until this moment. That the fascination that UFOs have for me has never faded, even though I no longer believe that they objectively exist as physical machines. And I think you spoke of this in your introduction, that I went to college, I majored in classical and Semitic languages. I focused eventually on the Bible and on early religious traditions, particularly Jewish. And the ones that most attracted me were traditions of heavenly ascent and otherworldly journeys. The part of the Bible that I kept going back to was the book of Ezekiel. And Ezekiel begins his book with a vision of wheels. It's part of a larger vision, but the wheels are there. Many have said they're UFOs, and I think those people are right. I think Ezekiel's wheels were UFOs. I just don't think UFOs are spaceships.
Well, I'm going to have to ask you what you think they are right off the bat. Here we are very early in the show here. But and do you think that it could still be part of the equation, or do you think just absolutely no, you don't think they're anything to do with extraterrestrial?
I don't think so. I think we say they're extraterrestrial because we intuitively see them as being alien. And the only model we have for alienness is to say extraterrestrial. But to me, they are visitors not from outer space, but from inner space, inside us. And we have inside us enough alienness to fill a universe.
Okay, well, let's just bring back the topic of our guest that was just on prior to you, Jacques.
Yes.
Lots of witnesses there. How could the same thing manifest in multiple witnesses?
I don't know. And there is the further complication that we're dealing with memories. And we don't know how that affected us, how that affected it. But I can say that there are cases, and they're often quite baffling, in which multiple witnesses see things that could not have happened. And I will give you the example, the miracle of the sun at Fatima, Portugal, in October 1917, in which a crowd that some have estimated as 70,000 saw the sun fall to the earth. How did that happen? I don't know. The one thing I am perfectly sure of is that the sun cannot possibly fall to the earth. So what there was that made 70,000 people simultaneously see it do an impossible thing, I do not know. Now, some of the UFO sightings involve multiple witnessing of things that we have good reason to believe were not there. And I don't know. I'll spit those words out. I don't know how that happens.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. Continue.
But I'm not prepared to say that the things they saw were actually there.
Well, what about when things are backed up with radar data and other data?
Like, what other data are we talking about?
Filming, for instance, the Nimitz case, when they had, gun footage of these objects, and even the Pentagon is, saying that these are unidentified, not knowing what they are. Of course, that doesn't mean they're alien, but still, what about when things are backed up with other evidence besides?
Yeah, I think I've seen some videos about those famous Navy videos, suggesting that at least one of them, which seems to be zooming along the surface of the water, is in fact a weather balloon, and that the apparent velocity of the thing is the velocity of the jet. I will not swear that this is the answer, but the evidence hardly seems to me to support the idea that we've been visited for the past 70 years by extraterrestrials.
All right. So, but go ahead.
And I've dodged your question about the radar, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was not only, like, just for instance, the Nimitz case, since I mentioned that, it wasn't just one ship. It was multiple ships that had this on the radar. It was the Hawkeye, above, they had all the data on this. And we're talking about sophisticated equipment here. So not only was it eyewitness, but, it was on the radar and footage.
Which it seems to me makes it just as, if anything, more likely that there was some sort of a glitch in the equipment that produced.
How could that be if there's 3 radar units all recording the same thing? This isn't the only case, but I'm just saying they're all recording at the same time, the finest equipment that can be made today, and you're saying it's all failing at the same time?
I'm saying that it does things that we don't quite expect it to do.
The radar.
Yeah. And when we talk about the radar, I think we have to recognize, and this is coming back to where I dropped your question, that often things appear on the radar that don't appear, that are not seen. Like this was the case in the famous chase in Belgium in March of 1990, where pilots were sent up to pursue objects that were seen from the ground. They got radar locks on these objects. They could not see them. And they experienced on the radar the object zooming away at supersonic speeds without a sonic boom. That, to me, is pretty convincing evidence that whatever we're dealing with there is not a solid object.
And what are you proposing that it is?
That case I don't explain. But in my book, Martin, in my book that I dealt with the Belgian sightings.
Yeah.
And I talked about their triangles. And the history of the triangle is an interesting sort of subdivision of UFO history. When I was young, a teenage ufologist, we didn't have such things. That the UFOs were either discs or else they were cigar-shaped, which were larger, and we supposed that they were motherships. The triangles, the story that Jacques told us is a very early story of triangles. They really came into their own in the Hudson Valley sightings in the mid-'80s, and then in Belgium in 1989 to 90. Now, the standard pattern, it was not the only kind of UFO that people saw during that wave, was 3 lights and in the center, a weaker red light. And I would use two ways of approaching that. And I should add one other thing, that when people photograph them, they did not appear on the photographs. At most, they got a blob. Okay, there was one good photograph, and that turned out to be a hoax.
Well, there's actually controversy about that, and it's very deep. I've spoken to Leslie Kane in depth about that. There was some money exchanged, so in regards to that photo, so it's not 100% convincing that it is indeed a hoax yet, because it can't be replicated. Even
I don't know, this Patrick, the guy who did it, explained how it was done.
They tried to get him to replicate it, and he couldn't do it, as far as I know. I can get more into that. I don't have that information in front of me, but I looked into this quite a while ago. But anyway.
Yeah. So I'd look in a different direction, that I would look for what was inside the witnesses that they projected into the sky. And one path I would take is the Jungian path. All right, I mentioned that Jung's Flying Saucers was one of the other books that was in the Levitan Public Library. And when I read it, I couldn't make head or tail out of it, largely because I thought that when Jung called UFOs a myth, he was putting them down, which he wasn't. And that he showed that the standard disc shape, the mandala, is something that crops up in dreams, in legends, as a symbol of wholeness. And also there is another, what he called an archetype of wholeness, the quaternity, a foursome of which three are different from the fourth. Okay, so here we've got a quaternity of three bright white lights and a dimmer red one. But now, Eric Wellett, a Canadian sociologist, has pointed in another direction that, what would you say, complements Jung's. And that is, what was the symbolism of white lights and a red light? Remember, the Belgian UFO wave began at the end of November 1989, right after the Berlin Wall came down. This was a time of earth-shaking changes, that communism was crumbling in Eastern and Central Europe, mostly without violence. And this is something that nobody would have expected until it happened. Now, the red star is a symbol for communism, right? And the white star was and is a symbol of NATO. So I think what people were seeing was a symbolic representation of what they knew was happening around them.
Well, wasn't there dozens of police officers that in the Belgian wave that reported seeing them?
Yeah, and this gets into the problem of how you've got multiple sightings.
Well, I guess, I'm not agreeing with you here, but that doesn't mean we can't continue to talk about it. I just feel as though there's so many cases that with multiple witnesses, I just can't understand how your theory. And here you are, a person that's looked at this topic for a long time. So I'm not considering you a debunker for that, reason alone. But I find it interesting. So how did you come up with this conclusion after all these years?
Because I could not make any sense out of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. You've pointed out some flaws in my approach, and I acknowledge them. There are incidents that I can't explain. But there are so many flaws in the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Why would we have space visitors for 70 years? How could that be? And that they have not had the slightest impact on the lives of people on Earth. I don't know if you've read Donald Kehoe's The Flying Saucers Are Real, which was the first book to be published, the first UFO book to be published back in 1950. But there's a really quite affecting passage in it in which Kehoe describes taking a commercial flight, which is filled with passengers, and he says the lives of everyone on that plane were about to be transformed by the presence of the flying saucers. Now, in 1950, that was a completely reasonable expectation. 70 years have passed since Kehoe took that flight. Hardly anyone aboard that airplane is still alive. Not one single person's life has been affected in the slightest by the supposed visitors. How is this intelligible if we have spaceships from somewhere else?
Well, who are you to say that no one's lives have changed? Because I know plenty of people who have had, an experience, even just a major sighting, and their lives have totally changed. So can you put that in different context?
Yeah, that that by this time, a reasonable expectation would have been that the UFOs would make themselves known, that there would be no doubt about them. It has not happened. The early UFO books are filled with prophecies of this sort. That we're bound to see major developments. We're bound to see mass landings. We're bound to have something, an invasion, contact, something. The decades have passed. Nothing has happened. As the book of Ezekiel puts it, the days grow long and every vision faileth. Every vision has failed.
Yeah, but whose expectations that's an expectation that is put on an outside source we have no control over. That's our own expectations. We have no idea what their agenda, if they are, from extraterrestrial. Well, I'm not saying that I know that they are, but I'm just saying whoever is visiting us from wherever, we have no idea what their thoughts and we don't have any idea of their physics or how they got here or what they are. But
which then begins to explain why they can go at supersonic speeds without sonic booms.
That's something, like I said, in physics that they may know about that we don't. It could be something along those lines.
Now, I will turn that around, Martin, and I will ask you, what then is gained by explaining UFOs as extraterrestrial visitors, since we can posit nothing about extraterrestrial visitors? What is the advantage of saying that over saying we don't know?
I generally say, the listeners on this show know me well enough to say that that's generally the term I say. There's only one case that I've ever, and that was just last week, and that was the Ariel school incident, where I said, I don't know what else to explain of those creatures that, 62 plus school children had, saw firsthand. I have no idea what else to call them but aliens. That was the first time that I've actually said that I can remember on the show. I think extraterrestrial is a possibility, but and I don't rule it out, but I still don't claim that everything is extraterrestrial. That's for sure. I never claimed that.
So then I would go at it in from a different angle and ask the basic question, which was the basic question of my book. Not what are UFOs or where do they come from, but what do they mean? To treat them as vessels of meaning and to say that we see them because they mean something to us. And this is the model that I use to explain the cases that I took up in the book, including one classic case, the William Booth Gill sighting in Papua New Guinea. Shall we talk about that?
Sure. I think that's a great case. Yes.
Yes, okay, because we are dealing here with multiple witnesses. That something like 25, the witness who's been regarded as the primary witness, and this may be a racist colonialist bias. The primary witness has been taken to be William Booth Gill, a young Anglican priest of about 31 who was serving as a missionary at a place called Boyani in Papua New Guinea. He and something like 25 of his parishioners signed a paper describing how they had seen discs at fairly close range and human-like beings walking on top of the discs. Now, Gill said at one point, no doubt they are human beings, which should be food for thought for all of us, that we are now so used to the classic image of the gray with the light bulb shaped head and the huge outsized oval eyes that we forget that that image did not exist until the beginning of 1987. Prior to that, the people who reported seeing humanoids or human-like beings in connection with the UFOs described them in other ways. And in the case of Gill, it was that they looked like human beings in all respects, except that they glowed. So at one point he said they were humans, and then at other times he said they were angels. And to me, I would hold on to both, that they were human and they were angels. Okay, this I don't think is explainable if you suppose that these were actual space visitors. Why should we get different kinds of visitors depending on what book becomes a bestseller? I'm thinking of Whitley Strieber's Communion, and stirs up the imaginations of the people who saw it. Now, what were Gill and his parishioners looking at? Sky charts suggest that they were looking at unusually bright stars and planets seen through clouds. That was why they tended to disappear as the clouds gathered and return as the clouds dispersed. Something within them was emerging. And what I saw it as was the Jungian mandala, the Jungian quaternity, which they created together. Not just Gill. His parishioners came from traditions in which sky gods descend from heaven and manifest themselves to human beings. And their vision, I'd actually prefer to call UFO sightings visions than sightings. their vision served to bridge, to attempt to heal the conflicts between Gil and his people. It seems to me, if you try to say that these were extraterrestrials, you run into an insurmountable problem. Why were they seen as humans? And if you say, well, they were making it up, I think that it makes no sense at all. So I would say they were having what for them was a healing vision coming from inside, stimulated by bright heavenly bodies. But what counted was what it meant for them. Now, you used the word debunker a moment ago. And I want to say, I do not consider myself a debunker. I consider myself a skeptic because I don't believe that the UFOs actually exist. But I don't believe they're bunk. I believe there's something extremely important. And that a UFO sighting is what our ancestors would have called a vision of God.
Well, so getting back to the Father Gil case, there was interaction there too with the flashlights and the waving and all that. But you think, I just can't understand when you're, the Fatima thing, back then with all those witnesses, and yes, 40 to 70,000 people, and what they saw, was not the sun. And there has been a question about whether it was a UFO, and then the church got involved and said it was something holy, and but they, I don't know how all of these people can see the same thing at the same time. And one other point I want to make here is, again, last week's guest, there was also a first-hand witness too, who was a school child at the time in 1994 in Rua, Africa, at the Ariel school, when they saw the beings, firsthand, and one was, kind of skimming along and blinking out and blinking in, like it didn't look like it was actually running. This is according, to a witness. But when they drew pictures of them, they did have the big almond eyes, black eyes like that. Now, the point I'm getting at is these kids, so isolated, had no idea, had never heard of the word UFO, had never heard of, the word of aliens or anything like that. Yet they all witnessed this, and some of them is, very young, all witnessed this, and to this day, their stories have never changed.
And what date are we talking about?
What's that?
What date are we talking
1994.
about? Yeah.
And had nothing to do with Whitley Strieber, because this is South Africa, and just completely isolated, very small little village, small town. There was no exposure to UFOs there.
How do you know that?
Well, according to, people that have actually interviewed them, my guest last week, that they just never had any exposure. Are you thinking that you would think that they would have to have exposure to come up with this?
Yeah. I would want to find somebody who describes those huge eyes prior to communion. I mean, if you look, Patrick Wiega did a book on UFO occupants with depiction, with artwork depicting them. The huge eyes don't appear until 1987.
What about Barney Hill? I saw that you wrote on his book. Those are pretty large eyes that he drew.
No, not like Strieber's. Now, what was remarkable about Barney Hill's eyes was that they were wraparound. And Martin Kottmeyer has, I think, demonstrated very convincingly that the wraparound eyes came from a science fiction, a science fiction TV show, The Outer Limits. That it was The Outer Limits in February of 1964 that first introduced them, and then 2 weeks later they turn up in Barney Hill's Hypnotic Regressions. Now, Betty Hill denied that this was possible. She said we never watched that show. Barney would never have watched it. But things like that are in the air. He may have heard his co-workers talking about it. And we can look at, I have the picture, the sketch that Barney did. And it's in my book of the beings that that he remembered.
Yes, I have it. I have your book here too.
Yeah, just I'll move it up here. Now notice those eyes have iris. I won't say iris and pupil because I don't see a pupil, but they are like human eyes in that they've got at least an iris. Now in Whitley Strieber's, I'm sorry, I'm putting it in the wrong direction, but in Whitley Strieber's, this is solid black with sort of a split running down from one corner of the eye to another. These do not seem to me at all to be the same kind of eyes.
All right. Well, I'm gonna keep arguing this Ariel school because they all said there were black eyes, and they're very little children. There's no way they could have coordinated 65 children to all do the same thing. When they came running in from the playground, the teachers went out after two teachers went out and saw the object, and I don't know if they saw the beings or not. But anyway, there's just no way these kids could have come up with that on even through a coordinated event.
I think that human beings have an extraordinary ability to communicate with each other without even knowing that we're doing it. I believe it was Bruce Hood in Super Sense who wrote that there have been studies in which students watch something like 10 seconds of a college professor lecturing, don't even hear, without even voice, just the sight of the professor lecturing, and they are able to guess with a very high degree of accuracy what kind of course evaluations that professor gets. We communicate enormous amounts of information to each other without being aware of it. And that's, by the way, what I think happened with Father Gill and his people. I think they must have said, "Oh, do you see that? Do you see that?" And at least a large number of those who were present, not all of them, because some of them didn't sign the paper attesting to seeing it, but a large number of them were able, without being aware of it, to come to a consensus about what they were seeing. I think something of the sort must have happened at Fatima, although I don't know. And I'm not sure, I mean, that I am tempted to say, well, maybe it's mental telepathy, but then we're explaining one unknown by another. And I'm not going to do that. So I don't know exactly what the mechanism was at the Ariel school. I don't know exactly what the mode of communication was, but it seems to me it is vastly more probable that there was some form of communication, some form of, I would say, unconscious coordination, than to say that these beings who are not observed before 1987 objectively exist.
Well, why don't you try to give me some examples of other things that you think manifest in this way. I mean, through some type of, you mentioned about the college professor, but because I really, I don't agree with you on this, to be honest with you, and that's fine. You have your opinion. I have mine, but I can't, I had a UFO sighting, and there's nothing in the world that made that any point that I can imagine where I thought, I want to see a UFO, or I have this disc, in my head, the thought of it or something like that. And all of a sudden it just appear out of nowhere. And what about all, the Phoenix lights, for instance, and the thousands of people that saw that, and they were all in different locations. They weren't together. They weren't communicating with each other. The phone rang off the hook for weeks from witnesses from that were outside looking at the comet. In a situation like that, how can you argue that?
Yeah, I don't know what the Phoenix lights were. I don't know what they were. But I'll give you ask for another example. Let's take one that I gave in my book. This was in the epilogue. Are you familiar with John Lennon and May Pang's UFO sighting?
Yeah, 1974. I read. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this is where I get very, very Jungian. All right? Because that's the, let's say, the model that I'm working with. That it was an August evening in 1974. And I must tell you, when Jacques was talking, I thought, an August evening, the windows open. Although in other respects, I don't think his experience is like that of John and May Pang. That May was coming out of the shower, and John was walking around the apartment naked, as was his habit. He calls to her, May, come out. May, come out here. He's out on the terrace of the penthouse apartment, and she drops the towel and comes out. They're both naked. And why I keep insisting on that is that in nearly all of the interviews with John and May, they both keep coming back to being naked. They go, and you'll see why I think that's crucially important in a minute. They see a disc, a domed disc, passing overhead. John says that if I had had a brick, I could have thrown it and hit it, thrown the brick and hit this object. It was so close. They had a camera. They took photos of it. The photos came out blank, which to me is proof that there was nothing in the sky, that, as I keep saying again and again in my book, the UFO came from inside. Now, why is nudity important here? Because if I were to ask your viewers, when was the last time that a naked human couple was confronted by a numinous presence? Surely they would answer, in the Garden of Eden, right?
Well,
that God is walking in the garden in the cool of the day, says, Adam, where art thou? And Adam says, I heard thy voice walking in the garden, and I was ashamed because I was naked, and I hid myself. So what I'm suggesting there is that John and May unconsciously reenacted this ancient, I would say, archetypal story of the human couple, the naked human couple confronted by a numinous presence that conveys to them, and we're taking another step here, their mortality. Dust thou art, and dust shalt thou return. Now, how does this happen? My belief is that these things are hardwired in the human mind and that they can emerge precisely when they're least wanted. This was the same John Lennon who 3 years before had sung his most famous song of the post-Beatle era, Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven, above us only sky. In other words, banishing the enchanted, numinous heaven. And the enchanted, numinous heaven comes back. And once again, we have the problem of how the two of them see it together. And I can talk more. I can give you another example of that problem, but you've already flagged it.
What's that?
The Pascagoula abduction.
Okay. I'm in touch with Calvin all the time, so I'm sure he's a very religious man, by the way. But
well, then if Calvin is watching, I would say I'd value your responses to this, because Calvin, I'm going to have to admit to you that I don't think you and Hickson were abducted. I don't think it was possible. You were close enough to a highway that the object that abducted you would have been visible to dozens, if not hundreds, of motorists. And there was no confirming report. But I also don't think you and Charles hoaxed it. That makes no sense to me at all. And I'm going to stop addressing Calvin. I'm going to address you, Martin. That what most struck me about that abduction is the police tapes. You know what I'm talking about?
yes.
Yes, that the police, when they reported it, put them in a room where they thought they were alone. There was a hidden tape recorder, and the police expected that when they played the tapes, they would hear Hickson and Parker chortling about how they'd fooled these dumb cops. And what they instead heard was something like that drive you slam bam out of your mind, Jesus Christ, like to give me a heart attack. These were two people who had had something that they experienced that affected them powerfully. Now, what was that? What really interests me, and this is not original with me. I cannot remember the name of the author, but it was a Jungian analysis of their experience, which focused on how the UFO opened like a coin purse. Okay, and I happen to have, by an odd coincidence, a coin purse in my pocket, that it opened. Okay, you see, I'm holding it right?
Yeah.
Sort of like this. You seeing that okay?
We've seen one of those in years. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm very old-fashioned. I sort of carry things around that other people have discarded long ago. That is the way a fish's mouth would open. These were two men who went onto the pier to fish and were themselves fished for by a greater fish. And I begin to think that just as John and May reenacted the Eden story, Calvin and Charles reenacted the story of Jonah. Something of that sort was
Jonah
happening.
and the whale.
Not, except it wasn't. The Bible never says whale. The Lord
no.
had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah.
Yeah. Well, well, let me ask you this. Has anyone ever gotten angry at you for telling them that what they saw was not basically a manifestation of thoughts or whatever. Have you gotten people angry at you? Because I'm going to be taking calls.
Angry at me. I've gotten people angry at me for many reasons. I do not think, I cannot recall any. The closest thing that came to that was, do you know the whole business about Westall High School in Melbourne, Australia?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I should say that Shane Ryan, who was the primary investigator of this,
Yes.
that he is a fine gentleman, and
Yes,
he and I have, for the past 4 years, cordially disagreed about what was going on at Westall. Now, what struck me in one of the witnesses who saw actually 2 landed discs, that in the drawing that was made of them, they look exactly like the breasts of a girl or woman lying on her back. And this was in an area which, according to the movie that Shane was featured in, Westall 66 was a known place for steamy liaisons. Okay, so I suggested that what the witness remembered was something about the sexual activities in this area. And one ufologist, not Shane, showed the witness what I'd written, and apparently he was completely flabbergasted. I would not blame this man at all if he were furious at me. I don't know whether he was or just unbelieving that I could have imagined such a thing. So I suppose the short answer to your question is, if they didn't get mad at me, I am surprised, because they had every reason to get mad at me.
Okay. Well, at least you have thick skin, because you're going to need it when I take phone calls in a little bit. You might need it, I should say. We'll ask people to be kind. Yeah. Now, when you are looking into these cases, there's nothing that you have found in all through history that of any UFO cases and witnesses and maybe trace evidence cases, nothing that convinces you that it could be, and I'm not saying extraterrestrial, because I don't really know if these objects are, but I mean, there's other speculation of where they may be coming from.
I'll tell you, of all the cases that you might cite, the one that troubles me the most is Socorro, New Mexico. April 1964.
Yeah.
Okay. There were traces in a good Jungian pattern, by the way, sort of like a tripod and a triangle and a fourth trace that is outside the triangle. There was one witness, Lonnie Zamora, who was regarded by everyone as a reliable witness. Now, Zamora could have dug those holes. And if you pushed me into a corner, I would have to say, yes, I think he did dig those holes and make up his story. But Lonnie, if you're listening from the other world, please forgive me, because I know that I am speaking ill of a man whom everyone regarded as a solid citizen, an upright lawman, and someone who would not hoax. But I cannot think of any alternative. And I am totally dissatisfied with this hypothesis. If anyone can come up with a better one, I will be interested. But I do not count the idea that these small humanoids, who were shaped exactly like human beings, except for their diminutive size, that they were visitors from another planet, that I do not consider. an acceptable alternative.
Well, Ray Stanford often listens to the show if he was the investigator there and wrote the book. I don't have the title right off the tip of my tongue here, but if he happens to be listening, he may want to call in to talk to you about that case. He knew Lonnie, and there it just seems like, you know, Lonnie was the last person out there that wanted any attention. You know that part too, right? So
That's
why would he hoax
I
something?
find this so unsatisfying.
But it's your only answer. Is that what you're saying?
It's the best I can come up with.
Like your Occam's razor, so to speak?
I don't know if it's Occam's razor, but yeah. I mean, I can. Okay, I'm going to do this. Is kind of cheating, okay, and I'll admit that. But I'm going to flip it around and say, how likely is it that in 70 years we would have just a handful of solid cases like this?
Okay, that's your question to me, and
Yeah,
maybe they are observing and want to just observe whoever they are, wherever they're from, and maybe they realize that they would have an impact on any type of society that would expose wherever they're from.
and then we get back to the question of their motives, which when I was a teenage ufologist, I gave the same answer that I've heard from you. We can't put ourselves in their place because we don't know what their place is. And it's only now that I would say this strips the extraterrestrial hypothesis of any explanatory power it might have.
And can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, because if we don't have any idea what kind of behavior would be expected of alien visitors, then what do we gain by saying it is alien visitors?
But that's has nothing to do with that would be like we're not going to change dark matter, but we don't know what it is. You know, I mean, I don't understand your reasoning there.
When Kehoe in 1950 said, these are beings from other planets visiting us, he thought he knew what we could expect from that. He thought he knew what space visitors could be expected to do. And therefore, that was an answer to the question of what people were seeing. 70 years later, all we can say is whatever they're doing is something utterly unlike what we might imagine them to be doing. In which case, we don't know any more than we did to start out with.
Yeah, but what does it have to do with us? I mean, I'll say it again, that's maybe your expectations or maybe some other people's expectations as well. But that has nothing to do with the actual situation. 70 years is a little tiny blip of time when it comes to, you know, the cosmos, so to speak. I mean, what is 70 years? Why not 2,000 years or 50 years or 10 years? What's the difference?
Now I don't understand your point.
Okay, it sounds to me like you're saying 7 years later we don't know anything and we should know something by now. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think if you read the UFO books from back then, they were filled with that expectation. It's the most reasonable expectation in the world.
Why is it reasonable? That's our thoughts. It has nothing to do with what's happening.
I think because when you say that there are visitors, we assume these are intelligent beings, the kind of beings that we might communicate with. And unless we presuppose some sort of shared understandings, then to say that it's intelligent beings makes no sense. I mean, I remember when I was a teenage ufologist, I remember I drew a cartoon, and the cartoon showed a couple of Native Americans by a shore watching 3 ships approach, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And one of the Native Americans says to the other, "You brought me all the way out here to look at temperature inversions?" Okay, good, you left. I mean, I thought it was a pretty funny cartoon. But when the natives encountered these alien craft that appeared on their horizon, the consequences were clear very, very soon. That nothing of the sort has happened with the UFOs seems to me to cast a tremendous shadow on whether it is helpful to call them visitors. Unless you do it as I do, to speak of them as visitors from inside us, telling us things that we need to know. Not necessarily want to know, by the way.
Yeah. Well, if I argue with you more, I'm basically going to be saying the same thing, because my thoughts are that, whatever it is may just be observing, may not choose to interact. And like you said, when you were back in the 1960s, the thinking, how do we know what their thinking is? We have no idea how they think. We couldn't even imagine it if wherever they're from, again, they may not be extraterrestrial. I don't know what it is. But anyway, I'm opening the line up, and be respectful. It's 855-472-5483. The line is open if anyone wants to call in. I was seeing some chats that were, let's see. I'm reading this right off the cuff here, so I don't know what it's exactly saying. It says, please ask him if he believes panda bears. What? Oh, never mind.
No, that sounds like
Do you believe in panda bears? Scientists declined their existence for 75 years, yet they are real. I think he's trying to make a point.
So now why, if I believe in panda bears, why should I believe in UFOs?
It's just that, he's saying that scientists. I just picked a one to read right off the bat that was addressed to me, and basically saying that there was a denial for 75 years, and they did exist after all. But anyway, the line is open. Again, that number is 855-472-5483. I know people want to call and talk, so that line is open. And we actually have, 6 lines. Anyone could call in. Last week, the phone was ringing off the hook. We had a lot of calls, but you never know. Sometimes we will not get any calls. So are there other people that share your belief? Do we call it a belief? Is that what you call it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm following in the footsteps of Jacques Vallée. I mean, we don't totally agree on everything, but what Vallée flagged in his seminal book, Passport to Magonia, and this is a point that I could have made much earlier, that the UFOs seem to reflect the technology of the society that observes them. which will make excellent sense if they're a human phenomenon, no sense if they're visitors from elsewhere. Have any of your guests talked about the airship of 1897?
Yes, with the lights coming down and all that.
Yes, and people actually making contact with the pilots of the airship. Only these are not intergalactic aliens, but American inventors, often from New York State, who have an odd tendency to be named Wilson. Now, what were these people seeing? What was the experience when they met the pilots? Because just like the falling sun at Fatima, these are things that there's no way they can have existed. Would you agree with that?
Well, I could agree that there's no technology that we had at that time, but I'm not saying I can agree. I mean, if we are being visited by whoever, why would it be just 1947? And I did see in your book that you did have some earlier, very early accounts of your explanation of, I guess, people manifesting back in the 1680s in Africa and other places like that.
What the people in 1897 were describing were craft that were just a step ahead of the technology of 1897. That they were sort of like super dirigibles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and yet they were having, as far as we can tell, real experiences. Jerry Clark had a really fascinating piece. I think it was in the International UFO Reporter about a rabbi in Beaumont, Texas, who saw the airship landed, met the pilot, and shook hands with him. And I found myself asking, why would a rabbi be going out to a farm to interview the pilot of an airship? And I could only Jerry proved quite conclusively, I think, that this rabbi actually existed. Nobody made him up. Although I don't know what the story that he himself told actually was. But that the way I understood it is that he was from Germany. In Beaumont, a rabbi in Beaumont, Texas, in the 1890s would have been doubly alien as a Jew and as a foreigner. But by shaking hands with the pilot of the airship, he became part of the American story of invention and innovation, which reached this brings us back to what we talked about right in the break beforehand, that reached one of its high points not far from where I live in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, a couple of decades later with the Wright brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think we're dealing with stories that have that double aspect of being a creation, call it a legendary creation, of the time, and at the same time come across as authentic experiences of the people who encounter them. And Jacques tried to maintain this by supposing there was some sort of other world, not outer space, but that intersected with ours and that mirrored ours. I would go for a more strictly psychological explanation, that this is something that comes from inside us, and the nature of the experience has a quality that I don't fully understand. But there's no question that that Jacques was one of the pioneers. If you wanted to draw a line from where I've been, it would start with Carl Jung and run through Jacques Vallée.
Well, those are certainly two pretty big names. We have Chris on the line from Houston. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hi, Martin. I've called before. I'm one of the people that's, I don't know if angry is the word, but irritated at your guest. Hold on, I'm mute my TV. All right. So I think what I'm hearing, I understand completely what you're saying, Martin, about your reservations about this reasoning. I don't understand his reasoning, your reasoning, sir. And it seems to me that it's almost like a form of, what's it called, pareidolia, where you see faces in clouds, or like a cargo cult, or Martin, you mentioned the panda thing, but people seeing throughout history and in anthropological terms, seeing creatures that they described as monsters that turned out to be ordinary creatures in the wild that they just had never seen before. So all of this seems to be putting the need for an explanation ahead of the observation of the experience, and letting an intellectualized description of a psychological effect drive all interpretations of data. And it seems backwards to logic and backwards to analysis and observation. I did miss the first half of the show, so I don't know if you discussed the Tic Tacs with him.
Yes.
But I would, if you haven't, or even if you have, you might just revisit that. And then I have, as I've described to you before, my own sightings. I've had several sightings. And if you're telling me that things that I've seen are a religious experience or a psychological manifestation, I'm sorry, that's just bonkers. And you have no evidence of that. Your explanations are more far-fetched than the observations of these craft.
Yeah.
That's it.
And I do you a great injustice by telling you that you didn't see what you thought you saw.
You don't have a right to tell me that, and I don't
a-
have an obligation to believe it.
I do have a right.
It's an unprofessional and unethical for you to say that to me.
I don't think so.
I absolutely do not believe it. I absolutely trust my experience. You're telling everyone who's had one of these experiences that they must not trust their judgment and their observation, and I absolutely reject that categorically.
Yes, and I can see why you do.
Tic Tacs.
And I respect that.
What does he think of those? I'm going to hang up and take it from there.
Okay.
All right. Hey, thanks for the call, Chris.
Okay.
Anything you'd like to add? We have another caller.
Yeah. That I think Chris has every right to be angry at what I'm saying, just as I've had every right to say it. I think back to one person who influenced me a great deal, who I mentioned in my book, who was a librarian in Western North Carolina. And she told me about the UFO aliens that she saw through the windows of her house, standing on her lawn. And she said to me, I know they weren't really there, but I did see them. I believe both parts of her statement. And my project is to understand how both parts can be true. Chris, let us work together to try to explore what it may have meant to you, what you saw.
All right. He's no longer on the line, but all right. well, we have another phone call coming in too, but we have. I don't know what your real name is. What's your real first name? And I know you're not calling from Zeta Reticuli. Who do we have here?
Lines over here. Greg.
Hi, welcome to the show. You have a question for our guest?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like a statement. I just noticed you have a career in theology. I mean, it's all theology. So it looks to me like you only see theology. Like, for instance, John Lennon and the nakedness. It's kind of a stretch to get that into a theological area. But here we go.
Yeah, you know the saying that when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
And that's what it appears to me. I'll put it that way.
That's possible. I'm going to say, let's try using that hammer and act as if UFOs are a nail and see what we come up with. Now, I hope you will read my book. I don't necessarily say I hope you'll buy it, although obviously I do, but there are ways to read books without buying them. I think the libraries are going to open sooner or later, and I hope you will read it and see whether you think that my hammer has worked fairly well on the nails of UFO.
Completely on a belief system, though, and a lot of us are looking at nuts and bolts. Like, for instance, the radar on those ships, you're not going to fool that stuff, and that was the brand new stuff on the F-18s. These weren't old F-18s. This was the new stuff. They were right out of the box, and they don't just show nothing. And when you got the ship and the planes showing something that the pilots can see, and they're getting it on infrared, it's not somebody's imagination.
And yet radar has been fooled many times. You have what's called the anomalous propagation.
Well, that's true, but that's like mostly older radar, and like Doppler radar, if you have birds flying around, that will do it. But weather Doppler radar, that is. But I think there's a lot going on here that you're just not looking at because it's not what you particularly want to look at, is my opinion.
Yeah, and that's a legitimate criticism. But I would ask, are there things that the people who advocate for the ET hypothesis are not looking at, such as that the descriptions of the occupants tend to be conditioned by what people expect to see?
Well, a lot of people are, well, you were saying about Whitley Strieber's book, but that description has been around long before that. In the 1980s version of Whitley Strieber was pretty sharp, and he did a lot of research into what things it could possibly be besides what he thought it was. And he went a long way before he even decided he thought that's what that was. Now, a lot of people have done a lot of search.
Yeah. Now, Whitley Strieber is an extraordinarily intelligent and, above all, an extraordinarily self-aware man. And it's worth noting that he never said anywhere that he was being visited by aliens. He just called them the visitors.
That's true, but it could be interdimensional. That's a popular one. It could be something we don't even understand because
it's possible.
We can't build this stuff.
It's possible, but then it stops. When you say that, it loses its power as an explanation. Now, what Strieber's image, I talk a lot about Strieber in my book, and Strieber speaks of them as having the huge staring eyes of the old gods. And I think he's right on target there. And this takes it back to me. I'm not exactly a student of a scholar of theology, but of religion. It's not quite the same thing. But yeah, I do look for religious phenomena, and Strieber saw what he was experiencing as a religious phenomenon.
I'm going to have to cut the. I'm going to have to cut the call. I'm sorry, we have two other people waiting. But thanks very much.
Thanks.
All right. Just real quickly, one thing I thought of: Travis Walton describes the same type of eyes, 1975. So I don't know. that's just one other thought. But I want to catch this call. We have two more callers. We have Ward from Fort Myers. Welcome to the show. We have to make it quick, Ward.
Sure, no problem. I must admit a big apology that I actually just woke up towards the end of your show. But I thought I heard the gentleman saying that, if I'm not mistaken, that the visitors, aliens, whatever you want to call them, are more a figment of our own imagination. Like we create these things. Is that, am I correct in saying that, or was am I totally off?
No, you're right. You're right on target. You're right on target. Only strip that of any disparaging connotations. I'd say there's something that comes from inside us that is real from within us.
I see. Well, I could disagree with you 100% because I have videos and film of actual aliens, and I'm not talking about, oh, you can't tell what it is or whatever it is. They've left me notes, and these things are real entities, and they're not a figment of my imagination. For the first part, I thought I was having poltergeist activity. There's a lot of poltergeist activity going on in my home, so I thought I had a ghost. And then I found out on my from my videos that it wasn't a ghost. It was whatever you want to call them. I know where they're from. I can't tell you myself, but it's not from my imagination. Also, not only do I see them, but does my mother sees them and my daughter sees them. So it's pretty hard. Not at the same time. 3 different people seeing things at 3 different times, and this all started happening in 2012. My mother's 90, and my daughter's 26, and none of us before 2012 had ever seen any of this kind of stuff. So it's really odd that in the year 2012 that all of us would start thinking of these things and start imagining it to manifest.
Yeah. I mean, are you thinking of people like beings like the classic Greys that you saw?
Actually, I've only seen Greys a couple times. I have all different types. And
Ward, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut this short. We're right at the end of the show here. I got to take a call real quickly. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, just we have Steve. I think you've called before from Washington. Steve, we only got a minute and a half.
Okay, I could be quick, or I could let it go. It's up to you.
No, go ahead.
Are you ready for me now?
You're up. Yep.
Oh, okay. My question is there any legitimate purpose to this? You say that these things are a delusion, closer to a delusion. I just want to know, do you see these as having some legitimate purpose?
Absolutely. It seems to me that most basically what these are is our way of dealing with our mortality. Dust thou art, and to dust shalt thou return. Okay. And I would not use the word delusion about them. They're real in a psychic sense.
Okay, so they serve a purpose.
Yes.
Well, that's an interesting twist. I wish we had more time to discuss that. Thanks for the call, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Dave. Bye.
Yeah, I wish we had more time to discuss that, but we are at the end of the show. So real quickly, again, the title of your book, Intimate Alien, The Hidden Story of the UFO. Wow. That's all I got to say is wow. Thanks so much, David. And we'll talk soon. You take
Martin,
care.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Okay. All right, everyone. So that's it for the show. Next week, we have Chris Stiles from Shag Harbor. He was the lead investigator in Shag Harbor. He's going to be on next week. And thanks so much, everyone. Remember to keep your eyes to the sky.